Hi everyone, my name is Olaye, and today I'll be presenting on landlessness, homelessness, and housing insecurity in Cape Town. So, just to provide some background on the problem, Cape Town's history has precipitated, well, rather South Africa's history has precipitated exorbitant amounts of homelessness, landlessness, and housing insecurity that disproportionately affects marginalized populations, marginalized meaning non-white essentially, and often non-male, and those that meet at the intersection of the two. And I think just to kind of provide some background on what differentiates landlessness, homelessness, and housing insecurity, landlessness is characterized by a lack of accessibility to actual land and actual occupation of land and sometimes homelands. And then homelessness obviously insinuates lack of stable housing, and housing insecurity insinuates fluctuations in rising property costs. And this also kind of snowballs into what precipitates homelessness and is often fueled by poverty, unemployment, and a lack of affordable housing, often leaving thousands of people without stable housing and dependent on overcrowded shelters, living on the streets. And that kind of is manifested in what we see today when it comes to the townships and the housing insecurity. And then lastly, Cape Town's current homelessness crisis originates from a combination of apartheid era spatial segregation, rising urbanization, and economic inequality, leaving many unable to access affordable housing and basic services. And just to kind of provide some numbers to contextualize the amount of problems that's happening, there's an estimated 14,000 homeless people in the greater Cape Town area alone, compared to the 3,500 shelter beds that are available. And demographic wise, about 61% of the homeless in Cape Town are colored, and then 25% are black, 13% are white, and then 1% are others, compared to, this is drawn from the homeless studies done by the government as of last year. And the average time that a homeless person spends sleeping on the streets of Cape Town is up to 8 to 7 years. Um, and there's a very high chronic homelessness rate. Cape Town's rate is 50% compared to the 5 to 25% that usually characterizes other countries. And the government's they're spending lots of amounts on housing. They're spending 744 million rand a year on homelessness in Cape Town. But the problem is that the spending isn't manifesting any changes for the community. So everyone's like, what are you guys spending on? Because it can't be housing. So, yes. Moving on. And just to kind of provide some origins on the legislative scale and political scale that kind of precipitated much of what we see today in housing and insecurity in Cape Town. Apartheid, racism, and the reverberations of these inherently racist institutions. As we all know, apartheid was meant to sequester off people and marginalize people, and it did just that. And apartheid just ended 30 plus years ago. So obviously the effects are still very novel and they're still very new, and they're still rippling throughout the communities at even more intense rates because there has not been legislation or, well, there has been amends to make it better, but it hasn't been implemented accordingly. And so just to provide some insight, for example, the Group Area Act of 1950 was an apartheid law in South Africa that mandated racial segregation by designating specific areas for different racial groups and forcing non-white populations out of prime urban spaces into underdeveloped regions. And this mass displacement entrenched spatial inequality, and the effects of which are still evident in cities like Cape Town. And as we all know, District 6 is honestly, I think, the biggest example that I can recall of this happening, well, reflective to what I've learned thus far in Cape Town. And we know that it was a forced removal of over 60,000 non-white residents. And District 6 under apartheid destroyed homes, communities, and it still has long-lasting homelessness effects. The area was very vibrant, and ever since 1966, it's just not characterized by the same vibrancy and by the same life. And like much of the area that was meant to be declared like a whites-only space is still vacant. So they essentially uprooted generations of people just to have bare land mass. And that kind of puts into perspective the pervasiveness and the hostility that kind of accompanied these acts and these laws during apartheid. In addition to the group area acts and events like District 6, there's also the Native Land Act of 1913, which restricted land ownership of Black South Africans, and the passed laws which controlled the movement of non-white populations, like making their access between urban areas and economic opportunities a lot more tight and a lot more restricted. And furthermore, the systemic underinvestment in non-white housing and infrastructure apartheid left vast townships underdeveloped with poor living conditions that persist, and these policies collectively entrenched racial and economic segregation, laying the foundation for the housing shortages in what we see in Cape Town today. So, and just to kind of highlight the organization that is doing a lot of the groundwork to reverse the effects of apartheid in terms of like housing, sustainable land, and urban use. The name is Nitfuna Ukwazi, and Nitfuna Ukwazi works in Cape Town for advancing urban land, justice, and additionally, like marginalized populations. And they're a coalition of very educated individuals. They have lawyers, professors, attorneys, advocates, and even teachers and community leaders. This is kind of some of what they publish and what they write and how they are very active democratically and on the community and grassroots movements. And the case I want to highlight today is the case of Numfani Ukwazi. They've sought a high court interdict against PRAZA, and like what Najma mentioned, PRAZA stands for again, I think Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa, and how the organization is essentially, it's corrupt. Everything is ties back to corruption, and how they're trying to defend the tenants who have been engaged in a slew of illegal evictions, where security officers have demolished homes, they've confiscated belongings, and all types of things. And they've also removed longtime occupiers, leaving them with no shelter during the rain. And the eviction was marked by violence and intimidation, prompting Mfano Nkwazi Law Center to demand that process stop for demolitions and returns confiscated. And what happened essentially that sparked the case was that evictions occurred illegally on the 19th and 22nd of August, where longtime occupiers were forced to leave their residence. And the evictions were very violent and they're very abrupt. And there was demolitions and things like that. And a 64-year-old man that we saw on the last slide, who was unnamed, was stabbed by a security officer during the eviction and is still in pain to this day. And this occurred in late August, I think August 24th of this year. And other occupiers were subject to intimidation, threats of violence, and xenophobic assaults. And PRAZA failed to produce a court order authorizing the eviction, in violation of the PI Act. And the Western Cape High Court is now considering an urgent application to prevent further demolitions and to compel PRAZA to return materials and belongings. So, and just to kind of highlight the social impact of what the organization is doing on the ground, they're using a collection of like dynamic tools to advocate for systemic change, including the use of law, evidence-based campaigns, and effective communication. And there have been changes that I'm going to highlight in the next slide, but they essentially work on implementing systemic change in sustainable land distribution, and they've been able to do this, but they've been met with a lot of backlash and a lot of legal hindrances, but they have armies of lawyers. It's just that the government, our institution, they have more lawyers. So it's a bit hard to see the effects manifested. And this is kind of like a visual of what they do. They have equitable access to housing, preventing evictions, and then creating sustainable codes of law to be codified to create a new institution for law and for sustainable housing. And they develop leadership, land and housing, and develop the youth. They have youth programs. They provide shelter, housing, materials for the homeless, and they also help individuals get back into the workforce to start their lives again. And yes, these are my sources, but to kind of provide a bit more background on what amendments have been made, there have been constitutional protections to help the marginalized in terms of housing and homelessness. There's Section 26, and this enshrines the right to access to adequate housing and protects against arbitrary evictions, but obviously that's been infringed upon, as we see in the last case. And additionally, there's been land and housing legislation such as the Prevention of Illegal Eviction from Unlawful Occupation of Land, the PI Act of 1998. And this prevents vulnerable occupiers, which is also infringed upon in the case. And these are both being cited in the case that Nufado Nkwazi is holding against the government. And also housing development programs, the Breaking New Ground policy is introduced in 2004, and there have been aims to transform urban developments by providing integration and sustainable human settlements, but there hasn't been much action being made in that arena as well. And then the government of the Republic of South Africa versus Grootbaum in 2000 kind of highlights the state's obligation to provide emergency housing. And the defendant won that case, and there was a prevention of homelessness. But once again, the legacy of that trial has not really manifested when it comes to housing and creating actionable change. And then lastly, there are new efforts for spatial planning and land use reform, such as the SPLUMA Act 2013, but it is a key attempt to address the spatial imbalances caused by apartheid, requiring all levels of government interference to incorporate social justice. But once again, the implementations on a high level are lacking, and there are still disproportionate effects of housing instability, lack of safety, and housing insecurity. But yes, that is my presentation, and these are my sources.